From the previous darshan, asking about the karma of whole nations. You had said that you would perhaps address it in a different forum.
The karma of nations. Okay, well, maybe this can be a kind of a continuation to what we spoke just now. It's a complex topic simply because speaking about this will require a certain detour. It will require certain great understanding on what do we mean by nation. Because as soon as we say nation, we already running a danger of going with certain preconceived ideas, certain kind of pre-packaged goods. And yet there are definitions of the nations, right? Definitions of the nations, as far as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, is to do with the language, isn't it? I think that's how it is viewed in the United Nations anyway, that nation is defined with having a shared culture, which primarily vehicle of that culture is the language. So therefore, there are, let's say, we can speak of something which kind of easier to define. So let's just say, when we speak of Germany as a country and as a nation, Germans as a nation of people, what is a common factor there is that the language is what unifies people there. And it doesn't matter how different the accent is, right? Or dialect rather, not the accent, the dialect. Because as far as I've been told, there are very different German dialects. You know, there is this Bavarian, there is Saxonian, right? So there's, depending on where you are, there is this dialect, and yet the nation is defined by the parameters of that language. So, and it's bordered right next to countries like France, right? France, Belgium, and the south is with Switzerland, you know, Austria and other countries on the east, so that, you know, Poland, it's already another nation, geographically very close, sharing a lot of similarities, but it's a different language already. So therefore, France will be defined as that nation, French nation. But then it's much less definable when we come to certain other areas of the world where the parameters of the country are less defined in terms of the language spoken, and that is the case certainly in many parts of the world which have been subjected to a lot of changes throughout history in terms of influences that other cultures brought with them. So therefore, Near East or Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, right? Asia per se, very hard to define now just by going by the language. It will not be as easy. For example, Afghanistan, you brought Afghanistan as an example, I remember. Afghanistan in particular. And there is no such thing as Afghanistan. Yes, there is such thing as Afghanistan as a country. But Afghanistan as people, or Afghani people, are Uzbeks, Tajiks, Pashtuns, and even in some places Urdu. Less so now after all these years of the war because how it was unfolding. But this is a country which speaks also different languages as well. Uzbek language is not the same as Farsi that Tajik people speak. So there will be more difficult to define now this country in terms of its national identity based on language alone. Because if this was just based on language, I could have easily slided into this very comfortable, deep spiritual discussion because it's all linked neatly to the way how the language is the expression of consciousness, and each language, it's a particular expression, all depending on geographical, climatic, and historical unfoldment of its people. Even the climatic influences are of importance here. You see? Mongolian language is the language of nomads and people of the steppes who often had to communicate on the horses against the harsh conditions of the gale winds. So when Mongolian people speak, it's as if they scream, screech. The language itself is penetrating, sharp, so as to cut through these conditions. And you take the language of settlers in enclaved areas like Caucasus, for example, Georgian, Armenian, very different language, different sound, different intonation. Even my kids, they say that when people speak Catalan, if you don't know Catalan, you will think that people are arguing. They say the same about German or Arabic. You know, when Arab people speak in Arabic language, if you don't know Arabic and if you don't know the customs and the culture, you might think that they're disagreeing about something, but they're having a very pleasant discussion. And yet, these definitions based on the language are not fully applicable here, or not so easy, you see? Because these territories, the formation of these countries, are the result of a constant flux of comings and goings. One empire comes and asserts itself, ascertains itself. Then this empire wanes down, someone else ascertains themselves. And some some countries, their karma is in being in these positions somehow, where they have been subjected to these very comings and goings. More so than other countries, other nations. Like let's say, the aforementioned France or Italy. Italian borders have been defined a very long time ago, because majority of Italian borders defined by the sea, And then just whatever left up from that fantastically chic-looking boot is defined by the Alps in its shared territory with neighboring countries of France and Switzerland, right? So what are these karmic roles and plays? Every country still is an expression of a certain aspect that in this fractal way reflects the totality, the fullness, the complete and utter fullness of consciousness that reflects in the mirror, which will give us here an opportunity to move from here to this other topic afterwards. So that fullness that the Absolute represents, that fullness of our very own self, that plentitude, that purnata, purnahata, has to be in the world at all times. This is an important reminder again. We made this several times that nothing is lacking at any levels of creation. Every level of creation is already fullness itself. Why? Because that's the body. The body in itself is fullness of the Creator. And so is the subtle body, is the fullness of that Creator. And so is the causal, and so forth. So what is it that happening then if we have this kind of tentative understanding in terms of the destiny of certain countries and cultures, and therefore, of course, it's people, is that they share these certain aspects that may often seem completely being placed in a very unfair position, in a completely unjustified, horrified maybe, situation karmically. And Afghanistan, I think, is a brilliant example of uninterrupted calamity that befalls in that country, decade after decade. In fact, decade after decade is an understatement, because this country, at some point, we could speak of was the glory of this world. The non-existent cities of Herat and the place where Jalaluddin Balkhi was born, which some argue could be contemporary Termez, which is on the territory of southern Uzbekistan, or Balkh, ancient city of Balkh, which is already across the river, and that would make it north of Afghanistan. All was destroyed by the Mongol hordes. They destroyed Afghanistan as a country in all its cities. So what would be the purpose? What would be the karma? I mean, not the purpose. What's the karma? Why certain karmas? Did these people do something wrong? It's not dissimilar to questions that people asked to explain the Holocaust horror with the theory of karma, which is not an easy thing to do. How can so many people perish? And what for? Why? What are they repaying? What were they repaying? Unless, of course, someone is completely being brainwashed by the anti-Semitism and all the rest of it, then one can find plenty of explanations historically. But anyone who has any common sense would, of course, be bewildered and unable to go there an inch deeper than what the time and the deed represent. So what these karmic situations of certain countries and certain people of these countries can only be really pondered on in terms of the totality of fullness of what is expressing itself at all times. And in that, there is no such thing as what happens to this country and why at the very same time something completely else happens to another country close by on another part of the world. So here are some potential hints. Even with all this being said, there are certain, how can we, what shall we call them? Maybe certain destiny that country has to exemplify, bring forth certain quality, certain dharmic quality, certain purpose. And that is so. Various countries perform this, various cultures perform this certain role. They play these respective roles. Even within a country, it can also be seen as one part of the country, like in the aforementioned example, in the United States. What makes United States also unique is its creative potential. And of course, one can argue to the degree of that, but one would be completely blind not to recognize this sheer creative potential when it comes to innovation. And then there are countries that in themselves carry a very different responsibility. And not long ago I spoke about it with the example of India. It was destined for India to be a country as the library, as that something where that spiritual knowledge is preserved. I recently heard a very well-known non-dual teacher speaking in a vlog style that, all the Westerners went for exotic teachings to India, and he was trying to make it that enlightenment is it's such a basic, nothing special about it. Everyone can get enlightened. Of course, that is absolutely true. But what surprised me is that kind of narrative of giving that message out there was that Westerners went in search for exotic teachings on enlightenment, often, finding and getting more confused. And they went to India, and I felt, well, first of all, I felt it was not very fair assessment. And second, I thought, well, actually, it's not true. The non-duality itself owns utterly and entirely its existence to the very so-called exotic teachings of India. But Advaita Vedanta is not exotic at all. In fact, it makes Christianity much more exotic. It makes Christianity a theme park, whilst Advaita Vedanta cuts to the chase. So, to me, actually, it can be examined in a reverse view, that Westerners, though smart and sincere and eager, actually went to the East and to India, not because they were in search of exotic teachings, but because they're fed up with teachings that didn't deliver at home, that were empty of any essence. So therefore, they went for a simplicity, not exoticism. And very often that is the case. And of course, those who didn't just get hooked to the dress code or the paraphernalia, although what's wrong with being into all that? It's just lovely. I've read somewhere, I forgot whom, but it takes a man or woman of great refinement and culture to be able to embrace values and cultures that are very different from one's own, very different from one's own upbringing. It's a sign of intelligence, of development. So therefore, those luminaries who have easily transgressed between the cultures, easily moved, became the exemplars of spiritual attainment. Those who were initiated into becoming a sheikh or a roshi, and though were born in maybe upper middle class or middle class of the Switzerland, France, England, or America. These are not the people who went for exotic, some kind of costume drama. They went for simplicity of direct knowledge. So what does that take us? If India was given here as an example of where spiritual knowledge had to be preserved, even if for generations to come and freely take. After all, they did not resist much. Centuries of colonialism, centuries of different the Mughal rule lasted for how long, and then Brits came. And yet, all that knowledge, all the emphasis is still on what is eternal. Just like Sri Aurobindo said, the destiny of India already decided. India is already freed. This is before the independence of India. It's decided. It's already there. We need to put our attention on more important tasks now. So if your question was with regard to Afghanistan in particular, with regard to Afghanistan and its people, it's just very well possible that there is yet also some quality, an incredible quality of perseverance that these people are going through, that they're being tested. And it's maybe horrifying to think that way, but if we are not to apply this perspective as a blanket statement that none of this makes sense anyway, because none of it is real. In reverse, all of this makes sense because all of this is real. This is Shiva's play. This is, after all, my own self reflecting in myriad of forms of phenomena. Then the very karma and the destiny of each country, no matter how horrifying its conditions may be right now or have been for the last 30 years or 300 years, that in itself part of what at the level which is not immediately accessible is what's going on. It's simply, as I said, a suggestion coming from myself. Take it or leave it. I'm not saying that this is how it is. I'm only suggesting that there is a possibility, that there is something that we cannot assess fully of what is going on there in terms of this, because it will be also immediately, and I'm okay and fine with that, dismissed or even ridiculed that, how can this even be a reason for people suffering? I hope this is not gonna add to confusion, because it's not, it meant to kind of maybe just a live illustration to what I was saying, but I'll leave this to you to put it together. You know very well that Soviet Union, Russians were baited to invade Afghanistan. You know the story, right? You know how it was masterminded by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the advisor to foreign policies, geopolitical policies to many presidents of the United States, how Russians beat that bait, and that famous, notorious let the Russian bear bleed to death process began. So Russians, of course, were there as a limited contingency in their military presence for 10 years, sometimes from late 80s until the, wait a minute, late 70s, because I myself served in the military between 85 and 87. 1979, unofficially, and officially from 1980 that the invasion began. Not considered as an invasion from Russian political propaganda. It was spoken of as helping the Afghan people to overcome this difficult time. And this is also not a straight cut, because Russians did build hospitals, schools, and roads there. Because their presence was not allowing them to bring full military contingency. It was a limited contingency. This caused a lot of human losses on the side of Russians. Russians here, of course, represented by all nations. Because they were fighting guerrilla war, ushered by mujahideen who were prepared in special training camps on the Pakistan border, where the weapon was supplied from the United States, and instructors were training all these guerrilla warlords. And who are they were faced with? They were faced with 18 to 20-year-old Russians, from schools and universities, who often went to Afghanistan after just barely 3 months of training. And yet, when all this was over and Russians withdrew, I, not so long ago, watched a documentary made by few people who started this initiative for going to Afghanistan and making researches, because there were a lot of soldiers who have disappeared without a trace. Their remains were never found. So of course it was supported, and this is a kind of initiative. And so this group of people who fought in Afghanistan in their youth, right, now all in my age, because this is my generation, went to Afghanistan and they filmed this. And there was this moment when they, in the village, and they, the mountain village, just like, Central Asia, look, it's like Central Asia. It could be in Afghanistan, it could be Tajikistan, could be Uzbekistan, where I grew up. These people speak to the locals, and then the man who was one of the leaders of these mujahideens, greeting these people and invites them into their own house. He invites these people who are now in their late 40s, early 50s, in the house, and they sit down and they, break some bread, drink some tea, and they talk and they go through memories, and they understood that why they're here. And what struck me in that documentary and in the way it was narrated very simply, and because it was made by people, it wasn't at all made as a BBC project or National Geographic even project. There is none of these annoying narrations of know-how, all it, it's just narrated by people who speak, translated, and given you then freedom to make your own choice and to understand the situation. What struck me is the respect that this warlord at the time, this ex-Mujahideen who is now obviously doing something else in his life, raising family, looking after his affairs, right? Probably have hordes of goats and, whatever. With that, I had sudden glimpse of certain experiences that was very difficult to put words on, because a certain sentiment found its resonance in the deep corners of my heart, in a sense of, again, if I'll try to explain it, I will smudge the subtlety of that. They call them shuravi, the term for Russians, shuravi. It's a very respectable term they gave to Russians who were considered by the side of the Mujahideens as invaders, who came to colonize Afghanistan, enemies, and yet they called them shuravi, for the bravery of these young men, many of whom laid their lives there, and something else in the background of all this conversation, landscape, people, children, women serving, doing their thing, yes, in a very, very orthodox fashion of what and how this country treats women. Spirituality can take very different forms. It's almost what I'm saying is a kind of a invitation for being misunderstood, a blasphemy. With an example of India, it's obvious and also very scholarly and also very protected by the culture. And although we could say that the one and the only dominant religion in Afghanistan is Islam, and it's the orthodox, often very, very, very retarded side of Islam. In most cases, it is how it is interpreted and how it is practiced. But the spirit of people is still the spirit that reflects in the hearts of those who try to find their way to God. So we don't know what destiny each country has to play in its people. Why are they played hostages to such horrific and horrifying conditions? But rest assured, it's not for nothing. Something in that corner of the world is being accessed that in no other corner of the world is being accessed. And what I'm saying to you has been also, paradoxically enough, reported by a lot of Russians, and even funny enough, Americans who went there, but not those who did not venture outside of their camps. An American presence in Afghanistan was a very different one. Not to now slide back into that thing we discussed, very different one. This I'm not making it up, you can find out. Afghani people do not respect Americans there because they didn't see any sign of what otherwise, in their view, people who came that far to defend their ideas and ideologies exhibited. And yet I've came across the accounts of something that this tour in Afghanistan did to the psyche of this man. It's interesting, it's bizarre, it's strange. It's like you go to space and you have that experience and you come back a purportedly a changed person, something happened to you. So you see, you can go to many different areas. You will go to Mount Kailash or some places of pilgrimage for a deliberate spiritual experience because you crave that. You want to go for that experience. But sometimes life will push you, send you to certain places where these spiritual experiences you never sought for will be revealed to you. And that area, that whole geographical area, that whole region is such a region. So what is it, karmically? I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that that Afghani girl who has her blog on cooking does an amazing job. She lives in the States or in Canada now, and many of her family members still in Afghanistan. And you watch her blog and you listen to how she speaks and how she presents and cooks the food. And there's no begrudge, no sense of pity either. She shares love, joy, care. Yes, she also brings the awareness through footages, still photographs. But mainly so that you can become more aware whilst you cook the dish she ate when she was a girl growing up in that country. I hope some of it can sink in. So